Morning, everyone. Happy day, Tumpty 110 of the general election, and welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's Northeast reporter, Jeremy Armstrong. Morning, Jez.
Good morning.
Now, this is the People's Paper Review, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast would just have to ask yourselves what exactly Keir Starmer would have to do to lose at this point. I suspect there's pretty much nothing. Anyway, what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on Prime Minister Rishi, this is exactly the point I'm making, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's admission that he had such a tough upbringing he had to go without Sky TV. More on that in a bit. But first, I want to talk about what it's really like having a tough upbringing. And on page 19, Jeremy's got a story in the paper about people who featured in the TV documentary Benefit Street. Jeremy, what's it like being brought up for them?
Well, you probably remember it was fairly infamous, wasn't it? Because it was described as poverty porn and all that, the programme which followed the lives of people who lived in some of the toughest areas of the UK. It was filmed in Stockton Town Centre. Some new statistics show that if you live in Stockton Town Centre, the likelihood is you will live 20 years less than the more affluent boroughs of Stockton on Tees. And it's a follow-up to a story I did earlier this year, based on research that was put before GPs last year, about a road in Middlesbrough where if you live at one end of the road, which shows you just how extreme this poverty gap can be in terms of life expectancy. A woman at one end of Martin Road in Middlesbrough, at the affluent end, could live 18 years longer than a woman living at the poor end, and it's a 2.6 mile long road. So it gives you an idea of kind of how you end up.
20 years. That's a massive difference, isn't it? That's the difference.
What's extraordinary about it is how close it is as well. So it shows you that if you've got the same road and it's 18 years, in this particular instance in Stockton, it's obviously been very well known for quite some considerable time. The Tilbury estate where they filmed Benefit Street, it showed people on the edge, really, relying on food banks, stealing, sometimes in order to get by, and talking very openly and honestly about that. It talked about people who'd had problems with addiction, etc. So it was pretty extreme end of it, really. And this research, the latest research, which shows that the difference in the life expectancy, confirmed that you still have people using food banks, still have people incredibly disillusioned with job opportunities and all that sort of thing, and it does contrast, as I say, the haves and the have-nots, doesn't it? Because ultimately you're living 20 years less.
Yeah, well, that's the difference between sort of dying at retirement, really, and dying in fairly good old age as a fairly elderly.
That's exactly what it is. If you look at the stats, it was around about 65 years old that the people within the town centre were dying, and then it was in the 80s when you got it to the more affluent suburbs of the same borough.
Yeah, it's shocking. So there's this new report showing there's great inequality side by side, almost. It must have been there next to Rishi when he was growing up. He just didn't notice it. So you've got Stockton-on-Tees, where men are dying at about 67, according to Jeremy's story. And then nearby you've got Ingleby, where they're living to 84, covered by the same local authorities. They get the same services to some extent. Now, most of us can probably name a couple of places near where we live where you can say exactly the same. What do you think, everybody? Where are you living, and what have you got on your doorsteps that shows that kind of inequality, if anything? Get into the comments, let us know. In Tunbridge Wells, near where I grew up, you've got Sherwood, which is the rough estate, down one end of the road where it's exactly like Benefit Street to some extent, and things are much, much tougher than, say, Ferndown, which is quite a posh bit of town, nice big houses, couple of grammar schools down there, and it's literally on the same hill. It's on the same hill. And, you know, if you're living in those two different places, if you want to go and apply for a job and you've got an address here or an address there, there's only one person going to get the job, probably. You know, it's going to make a difference. So, you know, the past 14 years that we've had, Jeremy, those differences seem to have grown a bit greater, don't they, between all those places that are unequal, or have always been, I suppose, a bit unequal. But can you remember, because you've been up in the Northeast for a long time, and obviously you're from there, but you've been reporting in there for a long time. What happened before those 14 years? Has it got worse in the past 14 years? What did Labour do last time for those places, if anything?
That's a valid question. I think there can be no doubt whatsoever that the gap's has got greater, and I think if you look at what the Tories are doing in their manifesto, so much of it is about, you know, lowering taxes and giving people a better deal who already have money, I suppose, in very simple terms. Now, there are many people who would say there's nothing wrong with that. If you're working, you should get rewards, and I agree with that completely. But the people at the bottom end, who maybe are on benefits, and they've already stated quite overtly, actually, that the people on benefits are going to be hit in order to save money to give tax cuts, because that's the only place they can find savings at the moment. They don't want to say they're going to put taxes up, so they're basically saying we're going to cut the benefits bill in order to fund tax cuts, the national insurance tax cuts. So it's a question of what your priorities are, really. And I think under Labour, I think what one can say is that the education system did improve. We don't have the kind of issues that we've got in schools at the moment, and you know, and the performance of people within schools, within the education system, meant that they did get the opportunity to get out. I think that was Blair's vision, wasn't it? Really, education,
Yeah.
education. And I think if you looked at the record, that was borne out, actually.
Steve says we've got upper and lower prestatyn. The wealthier in the big houses up the hill. They're always at the top of the hill, Steve. Ferndown's top of the hill compared to Sherwood. And upper prestatyn. And us lot are in the flood risk area, lower prestatyn. It's always the way, always live in the flood risk areas. And that tends to be the places where there was cheaper land. You know, Fleet Street was initially in a slum, and that was where it was cheaper land. That's where we used to have startups and coffee shops and all kinds of disreputable people like me and Jeremy would turn up there. But, you know, partly it was the sense of being left behind in those places, being unequal, that unfairness, which fed both the Brexit vote and the 2019 landslide for Boris Johnson, that red wall falling and becoming a blue wall, wasn't it? So although there may have been education and so on and some improvements, the people there still felt that they were being taken for granted, didn't they? That their votes were just guaranteed to be Labour or something, and they felt left behind and not appreciated by anybody.
That's particularly true in the red wall seats in the Northeast, without a shadow of a doubt. That's what swung them. One would assume that they're going to have to swing back if the polls are correct. And the key issue, I've got to be honest, when I was covering the last election, was Jeremy Corbyn. Simple as. It had nothing to do. It had nothing to do with the finer points of the policies. It was they just would not vote for Jeremy Corbyn. And I think that was constant right across the Northeast, Blythe, Darlington, Hartlepool. That's why they lost. In my experience, anyway, I can only give you my experience.
Yeah. But what was the reason? Was it because it was Islington?
I didn't believe in anything that he stood for, and whether that was fair or not, I don't know. I genuinely don't know whether people looked at his policies or what they felt he believed in, or whether they were going with the narrative which was given to them by the media before that election. It didn't really matter in terms of when you spoke to them on the doorstep. I remember vividly going around Hartlepool and just knowing by the time I left there, I'd only been there for a day, that they weren't going to win that. They weren't going to win that seat, because everyone I spoke to in all the areas where one would expect a Labour vote, they were saying the same thing.
So you'd expect those areas to be, you know, proper old Labour. Corbyn was quite old Labour, but I suppose a bit modern, woke, blah, blah attached to it. And maybe some of that was unwelcome. How do you think they feel about Keir Starmer, though? You know, a QC London.
I think
born in Kent, grew up in Surrey.
I mean, it's difficult with him because he's constantly being asked about being boring, isn't he? He came up here and did a really great, what I thought was a really good set piece speech to Labour at Gateshead, and it's the first question from Sky actually was about this in inverted commas boring image which he has. But I think it's actually advantageous in the current climate to be like that, to be perceived as a safe pair of hands. And actually, that's in terms of turning the vote around in Middle England, that's precisely what we need from a Labour perspective, in my humble opinion. It reminds me of, reaction to a previous girlfriend almost. The Nick Hornby novels talk about that a great deal, don't they? With Labour, they needed the complete opposite to Jeremy Corbyn, and that's what they've got. Regardless of whether you think that's a good thing or not, that's what they needed. That's what was required, and I think that's why he's turned around so quickly. Personally, I think that's why we're in the position that we're in.
Yeah, but also massive Tory failures have probably helped. Now, what do you think, everybody? What are the solutions to this? How do you fix this kind of inequality? Stuart says, I fully agree. Boris didn't win, Labour lost because of Corbyn. Fundamentally, this inequality stuff is about wealth, isn't it? You live in a poor area, you've got struggling schools, you rely on the bus services, they're being cut. You can't get a dentist because there's no profit in being a dentist in those areas. You pay more for food from smaller convenience stores and so on. You're surrounded by bookies and takeaways, stuff like that. Compared to living in a wealthier area, you've got better funded schools, everyone's got a car, the dentists are 10 a penny, you can afford to drive to the out of town supermarkets, you've got green spaces, there's no paint factories, Of course, if you live in one longer than the other to some extent. But the dreadful thing really is how easy it is to get from the wealthy area to the poor area if you just lose a couple of month's salary, have one bit of bad luck, have a violent husband, whatever it might be, and how difficult it is to get out of the poor area. No matter how hard you try, you kind of get pigeonholed and stuck there for a long time. It's that social mobility has not been repaired. Alan says the benefit system's a minefield. It's so complicated, difficult to understand for many people, especially the elderly or those with disabilities. Navigating it is extremely difficult. And that's why, of course, a lot of stuff goes unclaimed because people just don't really know what or how they could be entitled to it. You've read this report, Jeremy, talking about the inequality. Does it have any solutions about how to fix this?
They're all long term, aren't they? To be honest, and it's, I'll tell you what was quite depressing about it. It was the familiarity of the theme. So 70% of people are obese. Access to healthcare, access to sporting facilities. We did an investigation about 10 years of Tory government where there were literally hundreds, more than 1,000 sports fields being sold off right across the country. Facilities, access to facilities. It's a very complicated issue, isn't it, in terms of how one escapes poverty. Education is obviously key. In this particular area that we're talking about, inequalities and opportunity, really, to make it to turn your life around. And what they're doing is really, as local authorities, because they haven't got much money, kind of working around the edges, if truth be told, trying to encourage people not to smoke, trying to encourage people to exercise more, trying to educate people is what it boils down to. And obviously, as a local authority, one can do that, but they haven't got the resource to execute quite often. That's the reality of being a local authority now, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, it's all the potholes are fixed as well, which Labour are going to say they're going to fix, but have to see. Mike says the latest polling from Darlington has a 30% swing to Labour, but on the back of a very big swing the other way, probably in 2019. Now, thank you for your questions, everyone, on that. Now, yesterday, we got on to the main story of the day. After going AWOL from Normandy, Rishi Sunak, it turned out, done it all for a sit-down interview with ITV, because talking to voters was more important to him than talking to the D-Day veterans. And journalists have seen an early cut of the interview with Paul Brand, and it's not good at all. Don't know why he did it for this. Jeremy, can you take us through this a bit? Do you know what the main points are from this interview so far that have come out overnight?
The line about it, having it hard because he didn't have Sky, obviously, inevitably he's going to get criticised for that, and rightly so. Really, what strikes me about this is, trying to be something that you're not is so pointless, isn't it? Really, because you're going to get caught out. It reminds me a little bit of Theresa May when she was asked if she'd ever done anything daring, and she was talking about running through the cornfield. You would have been better off simply saying,
No.
I come from a middle class background. I didn't have any difficulties of that nature. That's just not the way that I am. I think people would understand that, because that's the truth. There's nothing. I should stress, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But when you're trying to be something that you're not, when you're trying to say, "Oh, we went without Sky," I mean, obviously you're going to take some stick for that, aren't you? Really. And the other thing about it is, obviously, what's really interesting about it is he was talking about the D-Day ceremonies and saying that they went on longer than had been expected. So obviously this was recorded prior to the terrible condemnation of the decision. And I think I really, really struggle with his explanation of that. So, it's bad enough making the decision to leave early, which really genuinely on a political and kind of human level is inexplicable in many ways. But to then say it was planned that I was going to leave for a long time, for me is even worse. Because that means I had a long time to think about this. And at no stage did anyone say to them, "You know what, don't you really think you should be there all day? Don't you think it's appropriate that you're there all day?" And I just think it's desperate, really. The excuses are desperate, but the decision itself and the lack of thought behind that decision is what makes it really extraordinary, in my view.
Yeah, there's the moral argument, isn't there, that you stay, because I mean, I think it was Steve McGann pointed out on Twitter that his granddad spent longer on that beach than Rishi Sunak did, and under considerably more trying circumstances, which is absolutely true. But there's also this politically cynical, really hard-nosed way of looking at it, which is you've got world's media looking at you. You're stood next to Joe Biden, and Keir Starmer can't campaign. Right? Stay there for as long as possible. All right, that's just what you would do. But there's been some stuff coming out over the weekend that said his team, when they were organising his diary, just looked at it as a photo opportunity to be stood next to Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron, and we can do without one of those. It's more important we talk to the ITV audience, kind of thing. They didn't see that D-Day was anything except a photo opportunity, and because he's got this kind of sofa government, I suppose, which kind of thing that Blair had. He got a very small cabal of people around him advising him. He doesn't listen to people coming from outside. As Johnny Mercer was moaning the other day, no one else can get access to him and explain stuff to him. So it's just what they think, and they're in this bubble, and they just don't seem to have computed it. So tell us what you think, everybody. Did you have to go without Sky TV as a young kid? How much did it scar you? Was it difficult? What did you have to go without? I didn't have Sky TV as a kid either. And I frequently moaned to my mum that my Girls' World was from a jumble sale because it had nail varnish on the eyelids and I couldn't do it myself. But it's not. I did still get a Girls' World after all that. Steve says, struggling is not the inability to afford luxuries like Sky, it's the inability to afford basics, food, heating, etc. This is something the son of a GP and a pharmacist is highly unlikely to have experienced then or now. Steve, you're quite right. But he should just say that. He should just say, look, we didn't really struggle very much, but I understand people who do, and I can see it, and for these reasons, and so on and so forth. Mike says, Rishi Sunak is at least as bad at campaigning as Theresa May at her worst. Tories are begging voters not to give Labour a supermajority. And that seems to be kind of where we are now. That the Tory Manifesto launch, which Mike's pointed out very well here, is usually a day, right? The party is supposed to be on the front foot, isn't it, Jez? That this is what we're selling, this is what we've got. We have control of the media today. Bang, here you go. Here's something radical, some big ticket item that will really grab your attention. And instead, this is sort of damp squib. It was led by a man who had to apologise again over the D-Day business. And after which, the Tory spinners, as Mike points out, were talking not about winning, but about ensuring Labour didn't get a big majority and that you need to have a more effective opposition. Does that say to you, Jeremy, that they're now accepting defeat and they're worried about how effective an opposition they might be in opposition?
I think, and I think one can't underestimate what D-Day's done. The last time we discussed about this, we were talking about there hadn't been a big moment really, and I think one can include the TV debates in that. I think there were. There's a lot of pushing and shoving in terms of the tax claim, but towards the end that began to feel a little bit desperate, and I think he's obviously on the back foot, isn't he? What should be a great set-piece event has been completely overshadowed by his decision to leave D-Day early. So regardless of what he did or what he said or how he performed, one senses, certainly thus far anyway, as we sit here now, that is the defining moment of the election, in my opinion. And I think it's really difficult because even Penny Mordaunt on television couldn't. There is no mitigation there. That's the problem. That's the problem with it, really. Even having apologised, and I'm sure it's a sincere apology, there is no mitigation for it. It's just inexcusable what he did. So I think many people will have been offended by that. I think many people will also question his political judgment, which is what's coming through right throughout the campaign, and also the decision to start it early. The other thing that strikes you about the policies, there are a couple of things, aren't there? One is, it's got that back of the envelope feel. As we said last time, the national service thing, they didn't have the armed forces behind it. You had senior military experts saying that they didn't think it was a good idea. It was a stick and plaster for cuts which had already been made, so it undermined his statement that they were going to invest more in the armed services. And so everything he said has been undermined to a certain extent on that. But also the tax cuts, this promise of growth, the Rwanda policy where he says it's going to happen, it's going to work. So right, okay, why didn't you wait for it to happen first? I mean, that obviously undermines that argument. If everything's ready, as he says, and the airfields are ready and everybody's ready to go, why not wait until September?
Yeah.
Why not wait and say, look at what we've done already, and this is going to work?
Well, the theory is that
someone has to question that, really. I mean, again, that's a really basic thing. It's an apolitical thing that it undermines completely that argument. If Rwanda's going to work as he says it is, and there's an argument there for that, why not wait and say, I've already got people on the plane to Rwanda? And that's because he knows he can't and he isn't, and that may not happen because of all the legal complications with it. So even that's a flawed argument, really. And I think that's an apolitical thing. Anybody listening to that would say, okay, then you could have waited 6 months. Why aren't you talking about it haven't happened instead of it's going to happen? It's everything's tomorrow, isn't it? That's the problem.
Yeah, that's it. We're talking about the future. Doesn't want to talk about the last 14 years. Phil says, when the King's there for D-Day, it's important. You would have thought so. If the monarch's hanging about, the Prime Minister probably ought to. Alan on Twitter has already come up with a meme of Rishi Sunak talking to 2 D-Day veterans about his terrible sacrifice of going without Sky TV as a kid. And Claire says, he just tries too hard to fit in. Just say no, not really. I was lucky growing up. Diamond cable was a luxury, and that's when it was finally laid in our street. Richard says, is diametrically opposite to the person on the street who would be loath to give up Sky, mobile phone contract, or their single annual holiday, although more cancelling those than they did a decade more ago when things got very tight indeed. So we've also got this thing in the manifesto we'll just quickly talk about. And Steve says he's more interested in Labour's manifesto. That'll be interesting. Well, they've both, this is the thing, Steve and others campaigned for the Hillsborough Law, which is the duty of public candour on officials and a public advocate and full sort of answers to the injustices that we've seen with Hillsborough, Grenfell, Orgreave, the nuclear test veterans and so on. Lib Dems have promised the public advocate and a Hillsborough Law to have a duty of candour. The Tories just said, well, you have some kind of a public advocate, which is basically a tax-funded lawyer to act for some of these people. You can guarantee it's just the worst thought through, most minor version of the thing that's actually being asked for. We'll have to see what Labour says on that. As Labour's going to be more fully fledged. They've had more time to think about it, it would appear. Hopefully their manifestos have a bit more work on it than Rishi's, because he's gone quickly. It does seem that it's a bit back of the fag packet, as Jeremy says. But one of the things that the Mirror says is that, well, they're at it again because lots of this stuff is unfunded, much like Liz Truss's disastrous mini budget. The Institute of Fiscal Studies says it would lead to, the Tory manifesto, if it was enacted, would lead to £33 billion of public service cuts. And let's get back to the beginning of this broadcast, Jeremy. Back to Kingston Street in Stockton, where they filmed Benefit Street. Have they got £33 billion too much money? And how do you think they would react to this manifesto?
Well, if that's right, and you're not going to save that money from cutting the benefits bill, are you really? And it's a real problem. It's a real problem because he's on about being fiscally responsible. He's on about not just cutting taxes in order to win votes, which again is not that plausible an argument. But when you're talking about cutting services which have already really struggled through austerity, particularly local authority services, that again is a really, really difficult argument, I think. And obviously the people who've got nothing, when they're saying to them, I'm sure in terms of his Tory heartland, they will relate to the notion of giving them more opportunities and getting people off benefits. There's nothing wrong with that. It's how one does that, and also it's also about the paucity of opportunity, isn't it? That's the problem once gotten somewhere like Stockton. So you've got to. It's the growth of the economy that's really key, and that's the key battleground for both parties, really. And it's a question of, do you believe his plans? Do you believe Labour's plans? And also the priorities in terms of the two.
No, it looks like the polls are showing that no one does believe Rishi Sunak. But I think at this point he would quite appreciate a sign falling on his head, or a wheat field turning up, or just have some bad dancing. That might be the next thing that we have in order to try and lift the polls a bit in his direction. We'll see, won't we? Now, we have managed to find some good news in the world for you, and here it is. Now, it's been a grim few years, as Rishi Sunak says. We get that. Supplies have been throttled, prices are rising. Big corporations have responded with shrinkflation, reducing the number of crisps in your packet or the size of your Mars bar, even as they put the prices up. But have no fear, because that great staple of the British diet, the Tunnocks Teacake, has vowed to never, ever shrink. Tunnocks, as a firm set up in 1890, has said it will never cut the size of the tea cake or its caramel wafers. Hooray! Now, Jeremy, is this proof that people don't mind paying a bit more so long as they get what they need out of it? Which, of course, is a Tunnocks tea cake. We all need one of those.
It's brilliant, actually. I think because it completely contradicts all the advice as well that's been given in the narrative, which says we've got to shrink the size of it because it makes it healthier. But the problem with that argument, of course, is that the price stays the same, and that's why people get really cynical about it, because obviously they're making more money from it. I love the fact that he's saying this is a Tunnocks biscuit. This is what we believe in. We love chocolate. We think it's a great ingredient, and off you go. It's laudable, isn't it, trying to get people to eat less of the treats of chocolate and all that, and we touched upon it early on Benefit Street, but cutting the size of them and charging the same money obviously is not a great argument, really, is it? So I really admire the fact he's saying we're going to stay the same. We might have to put prices up, but our customers recognise and understand that. That's brilliant, I think.
Tunnocks tea cake's a luxury item. I don't care what anyone says, but it's also worth saving up for. And you can't have just one; you've got to have several. And there's nothing. It's got meringue in the middle, of course, or marshmallow. I'm sure that's based on eggs. So that's dairy. It's one of your 5 a day. You can have that. It's fine. And chocolate, of course, grows on a tree, so that's a fruit or a seed. So that's fine. It's good for you. You're allowed to eat nuts.
Indeed.
Right. So thank you very much, Jeremy, for taking part in all that and answering all those questions. Thank you, everyone, as well, for taking part at home. And we will see you all again on Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. Till then, everybody, stay safe. Tatty bye.